Welcome. Today is Friday, October 11th. My name is Jay Rosenthal. I'm the co-founder of Cultivated Media, the host of this program, which every other day is called Cultivated Live, but on Fridays, we have our Reporter's Notebook. It is our partnership with MJBiz. We bring you some of the best, most insightful, most important writers, reporters, and editors in the cannabis space. Today, I am joined by Omar Sacirbey. Omar, thanks for being here.
Good to be back.
It's great to have you because, every week there's like just a shit ton going on in the cannabis industry. And this week is no different, but we're going to start on a serious note in that a hurricane hit Florida, I guess, overnight on Wednesday. There's some severe damage, obviously, in and around the Tampa area, I guess. Although I just told you later today, I'm actually flying to Florida and my flight seems to be fine. So I'm not flying directly there, but talk like, is there, I noticed actually on Twitter that the cannabis companies like Trulieve and others throughout have been talking about their employees, talking about their facilities, talking about like real time how they're doing. I saw yesterday Trulieve opened up all their shops on the sort of Gulf Coast. But talk about what it means from your perspective for like the cannabis industry going through a disaster. And it's not exactly like every other industry, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think what we have seen in Florida vis-a-vis this hurricane and the cannabis industry and other disasters in the past, I think there are a couple of takeaways. I think one is being, marijuana businesses being very conscientious about their consumers. And in Florida, in Florida's case, it's still, only a medical market. So in this case, they're being conscientious towards their patients. And it's, albeit just a medical market, it's still, because Florida is the third most populous state in the nation, it's still, I think, in the top 5 of all marijuana markets in the U.S., rec and or medical. So just like anything that happens in California has an impact on the cannabis industry, just because the industry is so huge there. Same thing in Florida. And so when things happen in Florida to the cannabis industry, I think people should pay attention. And one of the things that we've seen is how Trulieve, Verano Air, these other cannabis businesses that are down there, Cresco, how they try to keep their patients up to date about store openings, store closings, delivery services. And of course, putting safety first. But I think that was important. I think stores that did stay open, I know, for example, Sunnyside stores belonging to Cresco, they kept some of their stores open and they had boarded them up and put sandbags in front of them so they could keep on operating, but try and keep their employees and their visiting consumers, patient consumers safe. So I think that's to be lauded. Again, all eyes are on the cannabis industry, a lot of them unfriendly eyes looking for us to looking for, the can slip up any chance, ready to pounce on any mistake that we can make. And we've known that for years now. So I feel like this kind of response, this proactive, responsible response that we saw by these operators in Florida, we can go back to COVID. And since then, even before then, to those kinds of responses. When COVID happened, people, the dispensaries that were open were doing social distancing with the tape on the floor before my local Whole Foods was. They were taking these safety precautions first, and so I think we're seeing.
And actually, like the Whole Foods and like grocery stores, they were deemed in most places essential. Certainly here in Canada, but certainly California and other places, it was an essential service that was allowed to open with social distancing practice, of course. But it's interesting because as the they were deemed essential, but also treated kind of differently than other industries, especially with federal government relief or federal government aid during challenging times. If you're plant touching, I don't think you qualified. Like there was a lot of that as well. And it is interesting in some respects, being good corporate citizens and good citizens in a community is sort of part and parcel of being a cannabis company. At the same time, treated slightly differently, certainly from a an aid perspective, but also, how they get insurance, where they get insurance, even in challenging markets like Florida, where, there's hurricane insurance. Like, it is not true. It's on the one hand, they're treated, they want to be treated well. On the other hand, they're not actually treated as great corporate citizens because of
Yeah. It's not always the two-way street that you think one would be deserved. And regarding the essential business, one of just an interesting aside, I'm here in Massachusetts where the governor at the time, Charlie Baker, who now heads the NCAA, he kept deemed medical retailers open, but recreational retailers were closed. I believe we were the only state in the nation where recreational retailers were was there maybe another one? Massachusetts for sure, but
no, I know, I think that's right. But I'm thinking, like, I know package store, that's what we call it in Massachusetts. It's like package stores were open too. So it's like, what is essential, what is not, was like,
yeah. So there's definitely, I think, some hypocrisy from the state and federal governments. As you know, as we've discussed, they when COVID aid was coming out, cannabis was left out, and that goes, same thing for disasters. Again, be it wildfires in California, the flooding that happened in Vermont last year that had a significant impact on cannabis businesses there. None of those cannabis businesses were eligible for federal aid. And we were doing a little bit of research on Florida. My editor, Kate Lavin, pointed out that she saw that in Florida, there's a state agency providing aid to businesses impacted by Hurricane Milton, but it expressly says, but we will not give funding to businesses that delve in illegal products. So out of their way, and this is a state agency. Okay, federal agency, it's not great. The federal agencies discriminate against us. We kind of expect it, but with some states, we have seen a little bit of love. Some states, okay, if the federal government won't give you 280E breaks, New York State will give you a 280E break. Some other states will give you a 280E break. So, but again, we're Florida, Governor DeSantis, not one that loves the cannabis industry.
Well, it's interesting because we're talking certainly about the implications, impact of an actual natural disaster, but it's also in the context of there's an election coming up in Florida in 3 weeks that have major impacts on the industry, and natural disasters can impact voting, right? Certainly, there's people who've been displaced, a lot of people without electricity still, and a very pitched battle to get to that 60% to pass Amendment 3, whereas you mentioned the governor is against Amendment 3, the hemp industry is against Amendment 3, the industry's poured in lots of money, including Trulieve, I think upwards of like $100 million.
Yeah.
And there's other elections too, and Rick Scott is up for re-election, but he's got a closer race, it seems, than it was before. Like, there's so much happening in like one state, and it's like then a hurricane hits, literally a hurricane hits, in the midst of this sort of political upheaval for the cannabis industry. We have some Republicans supporting Amendment 3, some opposed it, and Trump is for it, but DeSantis against it. Like, we won't know until we know if this storm has an impact on that election, which has already been stormy, right?
Yeah. Oh, one of the interesting things is that Governor DeSantis, he cut off voting registration, I believe, on October 7th, despite that. He said, well, hurricane hasn't been yet. I said, yeah, I think I'll register on my way out of town as I evacuate. I mean, what are they?
Right, that's the last thing, right? I'll get gas, get a generator, and water, and then I'll register.
Yeah, I don't know what but it doesn't. It does. There seems to be a scent of voter suppression there. But in any case, one of the other interesting things about Florida, something that I think a lot of people didn't expect to be talking about, a month ago even, was the race between Rick Scott, the Republican incumbent for Senate, and his challenger, Debbie McCarcel-Powell, who, well, Ms. Powell, candidate Powell, she gets an A from the Marijuana Policy Project for her position on cannabis. Rick Scott has been, long known as outspoken prohibitionist in all forms. He gets an F from MPP. But that race, according to a poll from Marist released this week, puts McCarcel-Powell 2 points within Scott, 50 to 48. So that's within percentage error. That could be a big win for cannabis, which is important. Again, if you're talking marijuana reform, it's you got to have a majority in at least one, probably both houses, if you're going to have a fighting chance to get some kind of cannabis reform passed. So yeah, happy to see.
It's interesting. I'm looking at the Marist poll now, and actually from 538.com, looks like that poll has Scott up by 2, but that is a departure from a New York Times Siena poll from earlier, like a week earlier, that had Scott up 9. But it seems to be all over the place because in earlier October, another poll had Scott up 3. So it's like back and forth and back and forth. But, you know, will the storm have an impact? Will cannabis have an impact? The abortion measure that's on the ballot, preserving women's reproductive rights in Florida, also have an impact. Like, these things are this swirl. In the context of action on a hurricane that has displaced people, it's a lot going on, as we said. But that's not the only election happening, right? There's a lot of things happening that, like, you know, we have Arkansas and Nebraska. Like, are you watching all of those things? Because it's like, you have like a MJBiz war room of like campaign stuff.
Yeah, well, it's not quite that elaborate, but we do follow it because, you know, on a personal level, I think what's happening in Arkansas and Nebraska, the fact that cannabis, Arkansas, that's going to expand, but the fact we're going to have some kind of legalization in Nebraska, I think is huge. I mean, those are not big states, but I think symbolically, when we're talking about, you know, a national mindset, I mean, we're a very diverse country, urban, rural, you know, red, blue, purple, all these things. And I think by getting a win in Nebraska, it just shows how much of a bipartisan issue this is. You know, Nebraska and California, voting, the same on this particular issue. That's hard to find. And I think that, you know, if you get wins in Nebraska, and then, you know, if the Arkansas expansion passes, that's going to mean a lot, I think, for reform advocates will say, look, there's, again, you know, people in red states want this. Never mind the people in blues. You know, this is what they want. So I think it'll make it easier for legalization and reform proponents to make their case and drag fence sitters along with them. But, you know, I think there's still a lot of how do I say it? Mischievousness going on the parts of some of our elected officials. If you look to what was going on in both Arkansas and Nebraska, you have Secretary of States there and courts trying to scuttle or trying to keep those ballot referenda or those ballot measures off of the referendum. You know, if I was a betting man, I would bet they would pass. So knowing that, I think these people are, and we've seen it done before. We saw Kristi Noem in South Dakota do it with recreational cannabis a couple years ago. We've seen, I think this has happened in Nebraska once or twice before, where they disqualified signatures or said there weren't enough, even though there may have been enough. And so it's even though things are looking good, you know, you got to be vigilant. You can't, you know, sit back. And that's what the people in Nebraska are doing. They filed a lawsuit to try and keep this thing alive. And I'm glad to see, because as we mentioned a couple minutes ago, you know, we were deemed essential businesses a couple years ago during COVID. We put in $100 million in Florida. And while we want to be responsible, proactive corporate citizens who social distance and do all these things, I think the industry has enough clout where it can show a little swagger, a little, you know, as Madeleine Albright once said, so show some cojones, and fight for what things that I think everybody agrees are right.
Well, that's a good segue to the last thing I want to talk to you about, and someone who never was short of swagger is Carmelo Anthony. See, that was a very good segue there. Carmelo Anthony came out, I think it was last week, and certainly a great story that Chris Kasaka, your colleague, put out about coming out with his own brand, right? Cannabis brand. And we've seen this a number of times. Ricky Williams, we've seen Carmelo Anthony, we've seen other basketball players, other athletes, men and women. Like it's not just always basketball, it's some football as well.
Yeah.
And others coming out with their own brands, coming out strongly in favor of legalization, of course, but also there's part of it's like, it's always great to see big names coming behind brands, and that's amazing. And it happens a pretty frequent amount, right? Like, now Carmelo Anthony's a star athlete and big Syracuse basketball fan. So he did spend a brief year in Syracuse playing basketball before joining the NBA. But like, first of all, that must be fun for someone like Chris Kosaki. I want to talk about that, but also like that is a big deal. And it was a great story as well that sort of came out in MJBiz.
Yeah. I think it is. It's both exciting if you're a reporter, and I think a cannabis fan, and an NBA fan, because I think a lot of people that enjoy sports enjoy cannabis too. And to have somebody like Carmelo Anthony speaking at MJBizCon, that means a lot to us as a brand, of course. But I think. Not just as a brand, but as a brand that's trying to serve its audience, right? And I think people know that somebody like Carmelo Anthony wasn't just a great basketball player, but he's a great businessman. And to see how a business to have somebody like him presenting his views on business, I think is going to be of great value to our audience. That said, there are quite a few NBA guys and other professional athletes that get into cannabis. I just remember one of my favorite players. He's one of these guys that was a little under the radar, but he went to Rutgers. I always like these small guys. He played for the Bengals in Ohio, and I'm an Ohio guy. Mohamed Sanu, he started his own brand within the last few months. He's a wide receiver. Kevin Durant, talk about big names, still playing. He loves
to talk about being high. Yeah, he was high on David Letterman's show, his Netflix show.
Yeah. And so and I think it's it's part of the normalization process, which, as far as we've gotten, we still haven't gone all the way, right? We look at Nebraska, where politicians are trying to scuttle something that everybody else takes sort of for granted now. But I think what we're starting to see is that there's, athletes are talking about cannabis not just as this, party thing, but, as a wellness thing. And I think what people, or it's easy to forget about, is that, athletes deal with pain and have to deal with recovery. And a lot of that, pain comes from, inflammation. You take a bruise, your muscle, or you take a hit, you get bruised, your muscles inflamed. Cannabis is, perhaps of its, numerous medicinal benefits, it's an anti-inflammatory. So, no wonder it makes sense that athletes recover with cannabis, because it's going to reduce inflammation. And so that, again, that's a personal view, but I think there's a lot of credence to that. So to have professional athletes in on this is huge. Even in Europe now, you do think NFL and cannabis, NBA and cannabis, even a little bit of baseball. But in Europe, there's a German soccer team that has a cannabis brand as one of its sponsors. And we know Europe takes things a little bit slower, a little more medical, but the fact that you have a cannabis brand sponsoring a soccer team, I say jawohl, so.
There you go. But it is, and we'll put obviously how to get tickets to MJBizCon, because we want people to be there and see Carmelo Anthony for sure. But it is interesting because it also came on the heels of Vice President Kamala Harris doing essentially an NBA podcast with all the smoke guys, talking about she doesn't want to see people go to jail for smoking weed, talking about, there is this, certainly NBA and cannabis are pretty closely aligned. They're players, but also pretty, maybe of all the sports, the most overt cannabis use, I would say, among the players. So it is interesting to see. And also Carmelo Anthony is just, friggin' awesome. So that's great too. Omar, thank you for making time this Friday, because it's always a busy week in cannabis for cannabis reporters, for cannabis editors, and all the folks at MJBiz. So thanks for making time, and we'll connect with you soon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You got it. Thanks, everybody. That's it for today's. Catch us Monday at actually maybe not Monday, because Monday is actually Canadian Thanksgiving, which is a thing here where I live in Toronto. But we'll be back Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific, right here on our LinkedIn and YouTube channels. Follow us. Get our newsletter at cultivated.news. We'll see everybody next week. Thanks, Omar.